All right, you're watching the Mike Nelson Show right here on YouTube. This is, of course, at the KQBH studios. How are you doing today, Dave? I'm with a very special guest today. I'm here with David Ellefson. How are you doing today, David?
I am doing great, thank you.
All right, so just here on the Rock and Roll Journey Show, I like to ask the artists how it all started for them. So, how did it all start for you? Why did you pick up the bass?
No idea. I mean, I'm literally a kid who grew up in the cornfields of rural southwestern Minnesota. It's like a Blues Brothers movie, right? It's like, we're on a mission from God, right? Somehow it's bestowed upon me to you're going to play the bass, young man. And I mean, who knows, right? Like, why the bass of all things? And it turned out to be a good thing, because even back in the Midwest, in Little Jackson, Minnesota, where I grew up, I got called in to play with a lot of other people because I was the bass player. They needed a bass player. So I got called up. I probably started my first band. I started when I was age 11. My first band was like age 12. And then those couple of guys from that band, they were 2 years older than me. So they started jamming with some older guys who were like 16. And then we formed another band. And then I got called up into, and they called me to play with them. And I was like literally 12 or 13 years old, learning how to, when a guy back in that day, when a guy knew like the solo to Freebird, you're like, that's like a real guy, and he could play Ted Nugent, Cat Scratch Fever, right? So those are like the tunes, that were like the really kick-ass, rocker tunes. So, and then the jazz, that same bass player that had quit that group also played in the jazz band. So then I got called up into the junior high jazz band, and I stayed in that all the way up to senior high school. So a little town like that, man, you're just looking to play with anybody, and then I'd always put my own bands together. And you're just looking for area musicians that you can play with.
It must be really hard for a musician in Minnesota. There's not too many rock stars that make it out of there.
No, and the bigger bands, the cooler bands, all came out of Minneapolis. There was remember, there's this band called Rox, ROXX, and they played at like the Armory in the neighboring town, Windham, just north of me. And I remember me and my friends going to see them. And then looking back on it, they were kind of a Led Zeppelin. They played a lot of Zepp. But, back in those days, this was the 70s, right? So this is kind of the mid to late 70s. So Kiss was kind of they were my Beatles, if you will. But, Zeppelin and, Nugent and all this stuff. And they were like really good bands. There's a group called Straight Up out of Minneapolis. They played the area, kind of the 5-state area, the Dakotas, Minnesota, Iowa, the Wisconsin. So they gigged that area. And these were like, ballroom bands, so they were selling 1,000 seats plus, on their own, and they were gigging all week. And there's a band out of Minneapolis called Chameleon that's in probably my junior and senior year of high school. They were the big band. I mean, they had like a semi and a crew and records out on a little independent label. And it's funny because their keyboard player was Yanni. And before Yanni went off to go be Yanni, right? And so that's where, that was kind of the, these are the gigs you wanted to do if you were me and playing in your, little band trying to, do the ballroom circuit stuff. And you're playing, like a lot of us who grew up around there, and a lot of my friends who went to LA, and, they weren't my friends until we got to LA, and then I got to know them. A lot of them were from the Midwest. We all did the same thing. And, you're playing 45-minute sets a night, mostly covers, trying to break in some of your originals. That's why when I got to LA and these guys are playing the Troubadour and the Whiskey and this stuff, I'm like, you guys got it easy, man. It's like, you just plug, there's already a house PA and lights. You just plug in, you buy your Marshalls, your SVTs and your drum kit. You go up and you play your 30, 40 minutes, hope to get signed. It's almost like every gig in LA was audition for a label or an agent or a manager. I picked up on that real quick. That this is basically, every band, Quiet Riot, Motley and Rat, everybody, they'd already done that, and they had gotten picked up and signed to the labels and stuff. And so I realized that's the name of the game, in Hollywood. But, look, I cut my eye teeth in the Midwest, that's what we did, doing that whole circuit back there.
And recently you played with your one of your high school bands, right? Taz? Was that
Taz, yeah.
How was that?
Yeah. Well, it's funny because Greg reminded me, our guitar player Greg, he reminded me that we were going to call the band Toys, because that was very popular back then. You take a name and you change it to like some, whatever. You change what, like Rox, ROXX, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like that was a popular thing. And And he said, I think we decided that was kind of not our deal. So we just changed it to we dropped the Y and became Taz, for whatever reason. But yeah, it's funny. We had an awesome gig a couple of weeks ago at the county fair, and we played the county fair probably when we were 15 or 16, So I guess it just goes to show if you don't quit or hang it up, and 40 years later, even Taz has a second chance,
And when did you move out west?
Yeah, 83. So Greg from that band, he and I and a couple of guys from Wyndham, the neighboring town, who we were friends with, musician buddies, we all moved to LA together literally within days after graduating high school in May of 1983. And really the school Musicians Institute, which is still out there, that really became the calling card for guys like us in the Midwest, because the West Coast was starting to be the hip, savvy place to be. Van Halen paved the way, and then, Motley Crue, and, we're then from Motley. Well, then I guess then Ozzy was getting, started picking his musicians, Randy Rhoads and Rudy Sarzo came from Quiet Riot. Now it's Quiet Riot became a thing. And, so it was the place to be. And so, having that music school there was an anchor where guys like us could tell our parents, hey, we're going to go to music school, you know what I mean, and get moved out there. And that, that quite honestly, that school, even though none of us ended up attending that school, it was the impetus to get us there, to get us landed there. The apartment that we got at on Sycamore Avenue was a result of coming through that school. That's how we got that referral. So, and then once we got there, we just wanted to get to know the neighbors and find beer and cigarettes and all the rest of the stuff you need to find when you're, out on your own finally. And that's why we met Dave. He was the upstairs neighbor, and he lived right up above me and Greg, and knocking on his door is how we found out about, his past with this band Metallica, and all that, and then that, that plugged us into the underground scene that was really starting to happen. There's all these great, underground metal magazines, fanzines, that fans were putting together. They were just stapled together or glued together, and those circulated around. And, that had all the latest news about Yngwie coming over and playing with Ron Keel and his band Steeler. And that's how we learned about Akira from, the new Guitar Hero from Japan and his band Loudness, and, all the stuff, Armored Saints, just everything that was going on around there. So even the bands that like, Motley and Rat that had already started to take off, they at one point kind of were in their own little underground, but as they got popular, now there's this next scene coming up behind it, which, ultimately was, I guess, driven by the big four, if you will, with Metallica certainly being the leader, but Slayer was kicking around kind of in the outskirts, Lizzie Borden, all this stuff. So, that was the scene that essentially I grew up in.
And you guys eventually settled on Combat Records. How was recording the first album for Megadeth? How was the process for that?
Shitty. It sucked, because, you think in your mind, like, and I'd done demos and recorded back in Minnesota with a couple of different bands, Minnesota and Iowa. So I'd had, very little experience in the studio. And of course, Dave had recorded the No Life Till Leather demo with Metallica, which was just, I assume, probably a very low budget, demo, but, it was recorded well. And Lars had put Hit the Lights on. Brian Slagle from Metal Blade had that Metal Massacre kind of compilation series that he was doing. So as I understand, there was two versions. One was with the guitar player Hugh Tanner, and then when Dave joined the band, they recut it and they put maybe that was the No Life Till Leather demo version, actually, that then they put that one on Metal Massacre. So, all of us, had some experience in the studio, not a lot. Gar and Chris, our drummer and guitar player in Megadeth, they were in a fusion group that had disbanded called the New Yorkers, and they had their success in LA. But I think, people weren't signing fusion because they were signing Motley Crue and Quiet Riot, so they didn't really come for them to get signed, but they'd had some recording experience. So, this is all kind of demo stuff. So, Here's Killing Is My Business, a real, proper label of sorts. I mean, an independent, but I mean, it's $8,000 can only go so far when you're trying to live off of it. The studios, the always expensive part back in those days, probably still today, even to some degree, is cutting drums, because you have to go to a big studio with the big room and big mics and all the kind of stuff. And, so we ended up at Indigo Ranch up in Malibu, which was the Moody Blues studio, which was super baller, man. I mean, it had everything. You get like a chef and all the living quarters and, way beyond our budget,
Especially for the first album.
Yeah, I mean, it's fine for the Moody Blues, but for little Megadeth. In fact, for us, it sucked because we're like an hour outside of town. So if we needed, beer and partyables, we had to send one of our buddies driving back down into town, and it was 2 and 3 hours before he'd even come back. So, but that's basically, we recorded that record. Me, Dave, and Gar in a room together. Playing. With headphones on, literally standing in a circle, going, count it off, playing Rattlehead, and, recording it like that. I mean, it was just throw and go.
And of course, with the Kings of Thrash tour that's coming up, you're going to be playing with Chris Poland. You're going to be doing this whole album. Are you looking forward to that?
Sure. Yeah, totally. I mean, I've stayed in touch with most of the former guys. I'm the guy. Look, from Minnesota. That's what we do, right? We just always kind of stay in touch with people, and that's that kind of was my role in the band anyway. Was the ambassador, so I've stayed in touch with everybody, even Jeff. Jeff and I had jammed together on a Rodney Montrose tribute at NAMM a bunch of years back, just kind of by accident. We're both on stage together. But Jeff and I spent a lot of time together on the road during the So Far So Good So What tour. He is an incredible player, and he's doing a ton of the heavy lifting on this. The band is basically in LA, so I fly in and out, and we rehearse, we tighten things up, and we're well ahead of it, because we really, there's things about those recordings that there's a lot that was lost in it. Even on the So Far So Good So What record, just because of how it was recorded. It was recorded fine, but then it was mixed with this pretty big glossy production. And even though that was our first real major label recording, because Peace Sells was actually recorded for Combat, so we had a little more money than Killing. I think we had like $25,000. And then Capitol threw another 10 or 12 grand at it, or so 15 or something, to remix it with Paul Lanny. But then when we hired Paul to record and produce the So Far So Good So What record, I mean, that was the first time we actually had a real, budget from Capitol. So we had a little, could spend more time at the Music Grinder down at Melrose, which was a bigger studio. And we'd already worked there. We recorded the Peace Sells basic tracks there. So we kind of knew our way around there, but it was a record that we came off the Peace Sells tour, had to let Gar Chris go. It's me, Dave, and Chuck Beeler, me and Dave basically composing the tunes at that point. And she didn't have a guitar player. So Jeff, we thought Jay from Malice was going to do it, but we realized it wasn't really, it was just kind of outside of his scope of what he was doing. He was kind of more the Judas Priest style. With Malice that he was doing, and what we were doing was much more faster, more intricate kind of stuff than what Jay had been doing. So he brought Jeff Young in, and then inadvertently Jeff got the gig in the band, So, but Jeff was great. I mean, he, and it's funny, what I'm finding out now is how much more Jeff played on that record. I thought he just played the 4 solos, but he played all the acoustic stuff. It's like the beginning of In My Darkest Hour. That's all Jeff. He played some rhythm guitar stuff on there. So now hanging with him, and doing these deep dives into these songs, I'm realizing all the stuff that he did, and he's really doing a lot of the heavy lifting going in and on the Killing Is My Business record. In fact, we sat down a couple of weeks ago, and I was going through it with him and our singer Chaz, who's also a great guitar player, because he plays in a Megadeth tribute band called Woke Up Dead, and in the Soundgarden tribute band. So he's got incredible pipes. He's a really good guitar player too. And he knows these parts. Like all of a sudden I started playing, Good Morning Black Friday, and he knew it. He knows it like that. So, these guys that grew up fans of our stuff, they really know the stuff. And Chaz is one of those guys. So it's fun to play with him, because he really knows it, and he's a good player. But just going into the deep dive, especially if Killing Is My Business, there's a lot of really deep swagger and groove in this stuff. Like I always say, skull beneath the skin, because that is because it got recorded so fast, in my opinion. A lot of the really clever nuances of the writing kind of got glossed over, speed became more important than just kind of the pocket, and it's a thing. Look, it is what it is. But now as we're diving into it, we really want to pull these things out. There's this really kind of upstroke, backbeat kind of swagger, very kind of Motown sounding. And it takes me back. I remember Dave always said, people would ask him what his history was. And he said, well, I grew up with 3 older sisters and they listened to Motown. And it's funny now, all these years later, I go back, I listen to Killing and I can hear it. I didn't hear it at the time, but now I hear it. I'm like, wow, there it is. He was right. And so, to me, there's just a lot of great musicality in those records that I think we're finding now with this Kings of Thrash thing. So that's why it's a lot of fun. And it's a celebration of how cool those records really were. They've kind of been glossed over, over the years. And now I think fans have been clamoring for them and asking for them. And so I find it a dutiful honor to go back and pull them out.
Let's go back to P-Cells. How did you come up with that iconic bass lick for that song?
Well, look, truth be told, it was actually a guitar riff that David written. Actually, he might have written it. Actually, I had a bass. I had this BC Rich Eagle bass. And for some reason, I'd ripped the frets out of it. It might have been that white one that I had that I splattered blood on, and then I ruined it by trying to put a Kaler bridge on it one night. I was sitting there chiseling away, and problem with the wang bar, on a guitar, it's cool. You can be Jimi Hendrix and do all this great stuff, but on a bass, as soon as you hit the wang bar, it goes boom, and the string just flops on the neck. So it might have been that one, but anyway, we were living with the guy that co-produced and engineered Killing Is My Business. Carrot Fay was his name. We were sort of living at his house up in Laurel Canyon. And I remember Dave, I think he picked the bass up and he played it. He goes, hey, Junior, here, check this out. And here, play this, So I was playing the lick and it's great. It's a very cool lick. And then we went to rehearsal that night and put that song together. And that kind of, obviously became, a driving guitar riff in it as well. So that's, that's one of those songs that, came together. I mean, Dave had the lyric and, composed the riffs and everything, but that's one of those songs that for sure was put together in the room with everybody. It's kind of one of those, a 3-minute hit song, and it needed to kind of stay that way and not get too elaborate. Lots of times the Megadeth arrangements would get very elaborate and time changes. And, if you're going to, even that one has a tempo shift, in the last half of it, but it was important to really drive home that, that first half of the song, because that was the listenable part. It's the part that was very hypnotic and kind of had that mid-tempo groove, kind of the first one Megadeth had, so it was a pretty cool moment with that song.
How did life change for the band after the album, in terms of touring, economically? How did life really change after the second album, or were you guys still kind of struggling back in those days?
Dude, it's so funny you asked that, because, I've been writing these little chronicles, right? Because I just do it. I kind of, I just always kind of remembering things, and, memories get sweeter over time. They just, thank God we're wired that way, that sometimes the hardships get less and some of the other moments, they just kind of become cooler over time. And so I've been writing. Last week I did the Killing Chronicles, which is just kind of remembering some of these deep dive moments of the record. Stuff that if I were a fan, I would love that. I'd be, if Gene and Paul or Steve Harris was writing like a studio log of when they made Killers and Number of the Beast, I'd be like, oh my God, this is amazing. So I love this stuff because I'm a fan too, So I started this little one, So Far So Good, So What's the Story? And Jeff's going to weigh in a little bit on this too, and because he's got obviously he's got a lot of great memories and things that I don't remember that he can kind of banter back and forth on. But it's funny. The reason we called the record So Far So Good, So What is because after the Killings, or after the P-Cells tour, it was a long tour. It was at least a year, maybe a year and a half. It was long. We did a lot of work with it. It started with, in a way, it started with us doing 3 weeks of playing every song we knew before we recorded the P-Cells album. And it was during that tour we played at Irving Plaza in New York City, and Tim Carr, who was the A&R guy from Capitol Records, came down to see us at the urging of our agent, Andy Summers. And he saw us at there, and he liked what he saw. And we went home, we recorded the record for Combat. And then it was at that time, Michael Alago from Elektra, who had signed Metallica, had thrown a line in the water to say, "Hey, I'm going fishing for Megadeth. I want to sign him to Elektra." And Michael's lovely, and he's really got kind of stirred the waters, and then that got Tim Carr, engaged to get the offer, and Capitol ended up winning out on the deal. Of course, the rub was always, how can we be at the same label Metallica is? I think that Dave would have never been at peace with that, and so it worked out fine. It was where it was supposed to go, and being at Capitol, I mean, what a great label, what I mean? It's the home of the Beatles, and Frank Sinatra, and all the greats, so it was cool. But the record comes out, and before the record even came out, we went and did a tour with King Diamond, who had just restarted his new band from out of Merciful Fate. Mickey D was playing drums. Andy LaRock, who's still his guitar player, was there. So that was really fun. But that was kind of as Capitol was setting the record up behind the scenes. We were out doing that tour, and then we did a couple of dates with Motorhead. It was supposed to be 5. It only ended up being 2. And then that's when the record dropped. It was in the fall of '86. And then the goal was to land your first big arena tour. You get in the major label, you do the arena tour. So Alice Cooper took us under his wing, and we went out on a big tour with him in early '87 and over to Europe. So we went around the world. We went to Japan, did a lot of big stuff. It was cool. But we came home, and half the lineup had to be changed. We're in the studio, we're making the record, and it was our guitar player, David White. Gadget was his nickname, and he was funny. And he it was either me or somebody. I seem to remember I said to him one day, we're at the Music Grinder recording So Far So Good, So What album, and I said, "Well, so far so good." And he goes, "So what?" with a cigarette in his hand, like, "So what?" And it is very kind of vaudeville kind of way. And it was like, and that stuck. We're like, that is freaking brilliant, man. So far so good, so what? And that's how the name stuck, because it was kind of like, there's a saying in jazz, you're only as good as your last gig. And I guess for us, we're only as good as our last record, which was Peace Sells, which was certainly making moves. But, this was a new record. This is the next chapter. And there was a long way to go, so I think that was kind of it. It's like, so far so good. Oh shit, you look this way, it's like, oh my God, there's a lot of miles ahead. We got a lot of work to do, so plus it spoke well to our punk rock lifestyle at the time.
And with So Far So Good, So What, do you think the band took a bigger step from Peace Sells? Did you guys kind of improve musically, or do you guys think you guys were still kind of in the same era for as the album before?
No, I think we took a big step. And, I think a lot of it internally was, Dave was just processing this whole thing of not being in Metallica. That was really and then again, I didn't live, that wasn't my story. So I'm sitting over going, dude, we're doing great, like on our own. Why don't, but it's his part of his journey, that he had to reconcile. And, it's funny, Lars would always come to our shows, even James and Cliff, when sometimes when we'd go up to the Bay Area, they'd come out and see some of our early shows. And Lars would always come around. I think he likes Dave, and he's a fan of his work, and he was always a fun hang, and probably doing a little investigative, like what are these guys doing over here, so because it was competitive back in those days. Let's face it, we're all trying to get up the mountain, so but it was, I always saw that he was, a friendly kind of fan of the band, and so. To me, Peace Sells is the record that stepped us out of any Metallica shadow, which I think they were happy for too. They're like, great, Dave's doing awesome, man. He's got his own band. He's on Capitol. Like, I think they were kind of like, awesome. So, but I think internally for us, certainly there was some competition there, from Dave to them, and wanting to just kind of prove that, hey, I've got it, and I don't think that was ever a question. I think is like, I always saw Dave as a, fantastic writer. He would just pull stuff out of thin air. It's like, Jesus, man, that's freaking cool. So we were always very supportive to him, with that. And so, look, that's just part of his journey. So it is what it is. But, to your question, by so far, I think for sure we had, there's two things. One, becoming Megadeth. Two, coming out of the Metallica shadow, which was probably a little bit self-induced, a little bit maybe, because of Dave. He set the bar really high, and he had these expectations, and But I think, again, by P cells, we did it. Certainly by So Far So Good So What, we did it. We had our own look, we had our own sound, we had our own, just kind of our own vibe now. We were truly our own band. The back line looked a lot like how we kind of first designed it when we were sitting in our Sycamore apartments, kind of strategizing the band with the drum riser and, the stacks of Marshalls and, having this very kind of military look about it, So to me, and then to end the tour playing at Donington, which is the Download Festival now, playing there, that was big, that was with Iron Maiden, who we'd just done a bunch of dates with earlier that year, Kiss and Guns N' Roses played before us. I mean, they were on their way up. You could tell they were kicking ass, So yeah, I think it was a great moment, and then, then everything after that leading into what became Rust in Peace,
All right, with the Rust in Peace, how did the band change with Nick and Marty joining? How did the dynamic of music change with those two guys joining the band?
It was a huge, and they were certainly a part of it. A big part of it too is we got a new manager. Ron Lafitte came in, and he'd been wanting to manage the band for a while. In fact, I seem to remember even when we were on the So Far So Good So What tour, he was working with Rod Smallwood, Iron Maiden's manager, and he brought us over to Rod's office there on Highland Boulevard and or Highland Avenue in Hollywood, and we weren't ready for Rod. Rod had Maiden were huge. He had Wasp, he had Poison. I mean, he had big bands making a lot of money on MTV, and of course, he's always kind of been the ambassador to EMI, with the success they had with Maiden and stuff. But years later, we became good friends with him, and we even took a management meeting with him at the end of the euthanasia cycle. But he's been a great, ambassador for us, over the years. And we've done a lot of work with Maiden, and, Maiden Megadeth dates were always great. They were very just cohesive. It's like the same audience,
Yeah.
So those are very cool. And of course, Maiden were, super influential to, I think, all of us. But Ron, when he came in the end, in early '89, we needed to get our act cleaned up, I mean, to simply put, so there's now a second lineup change because of the drugs. We just needed to get clean, and, I think Dave kind of always resented it, you know what I mean? As I guess I did probably too, like, because when someone comes to you and says, hey, you need to change your lifestyle, it's like, fuck you, it's very punk rock, but, I remember when I was told, Dave had the manager tell me, because, and we just needed to get clean. We did. And so I'm glad that we turned that corner, and we got that done. And that was a big, Ron just said, he goes, look, it's all yours to have, but you got to get clean, guys. You just do. You got to get it together, and if you do, it's all there to have. And with Nick Menz had come into the band. So Nick was great because, he was looking for a chance like this, and he'd been he was brought in kind of as an understudy to Chuck Wheeler on the So Far So Good So What tour, but always with the idea that he could become the drummer. And so his moment, his number came up, and he was in the band, and he loved, the opportunity. And then I think when Marty came in, that's when it really locked together. Like, it was like, we looked like four brothers in a band. We sounded the same, we looked the same. It was for sure the most cohesive the band had ever been, and I think that's what fans like about the 90s, is not only did we look the part, but we sounded the part. Our records, even those records during the 90s, as much as they transitioned somewhat with the times, but we did it together, and that was the last of the collaboration era of that band, was really through Cryptic Writings. Then the manager after that, split everything up, and he pulled the divide and conquer, and, and that, in my opinion, that changed how it's been since then, I always think bands are better together, and when you can roll like that. Nick unfortunately had health issues, so he had to be let go, and Marty just decided, yep, I'm done with this now. Interestingly enough, the World Needs a Hero record was actually a pretty good time with the band. Transitions for sure. Jimmy had come in place of Nick. Al was brought in to replace Marty. And it wasn't really until we'd done some touring where Al had come in to replace Marty, kind of very unexpectedly, but it happened. And then suddenly it felt like a new band, because without Nick, but with Marty, it was still kind of this three-legged dog, if you will, So it changed once Al was in, then it really sounded like a new band. And then The World Needs a Hero. And then of course we finished that cycle up with Rude Awakening, which I think is still one of the fan favorite live records, ever from Megadeth. And we were really freaking firing on all cylinders. So that was also another very good. We worked together as a team on that. That was a good season of the band right there, I thought.
All right, let's go back to the 1991 Clash of the Titans tour. Are there any stories or cool moments that you could talk about that maybe we don't know about from that tour?
Yeah, probably some I shouldn't tell you. No, and that was a great time because that was kind of the pinnacle of MTV, in my opinion. And of course, because right after that, grunge came in, and that, of course, the MTV's still around, and they did their thing through the '90s. But I would say there was the transition from sort of the hair bands to the thrash metal bands right before the baton had to be passed to Seattle. You know what I mean? And it was a great time. I think it was the biggest that thrash metal would ever be collectively, really, until we did the Big Four, 20 years later, right? Yeah. I mean, really, it took that long because right after that, we knew on that tour that, in fact, Ron, our manager, he goes, guys, like, now it's time to step up and take the crown to the next level. And you can do it. You've got the ingenuity between you all to do it. The writing is there. But we got to take the step, and he loved Lakers coach Pat Riley. So he was really big on kind of the Lakers, mindset, and they were champions at that time. They ruled the frickin' NBA. So he would always look at that, that Jordan, of course, so borrowing from another entertainment outlet of sports, bringing that over to Megadeth, that became a model for us to how to really rise up, and that just goes to show how important really good management who really just understands the fabric of what they're working with, and he got it, he really understood it. He would really, he really spoke to each of our strengths, yet he made sure we stayed in our lane. It's like, don't go over here and try to do that because that's what he does. You need to stay here because that's what you're great at, and I like a coach, it's like, he coached us. And, as a result, we had our biggest successes during his regime, and so that's why when we started writing the Countdown to Extinction record on the Clash of the Titans tour, and when we came off of that, the rest of the '90s were pretty good to Megadeth as a result of, following his direction and writing the Countdown record that came out after Clash of the Titans.